I'm Group Product Sustainability Senior Manager at Hilton Foods. And Hilton Foods, if you've not heard of us, which most of you probably haven't, is essentially one of the biggest butchers and fishmongers in the UK. So if you've ever been to a number of the retailers in the UK and bought meat or fish, you've probably bought our products. Increasingly, we're moving globally, so we operate across Europe now, and also in Australia and New Zealand, and from next year in Canada. We also are moving increasingly into vegetarian and vegan and convenience foods across the UK and also globally. So we take a data-driven approach. So we're obviously having to go across both the meat and the fish side, but also the crop side because these animals eat. And that starts by understanding where we are, understanding our baseline. We've recalculated our baseline 3 times since we started our net zero journey, started with a financial approach, get a good idea of where are our hotspots, moving on to then sort of more increasingly detailed supply chain specific data. Then we've developed our roadmap, and I'll take you through that. And that's essentially how do we get there? How do we get from where we are to net zero? And then I'm going to take you through some of the projects where we're delivering net zero across our supply chain at scale, and how we're planning on developing those as well. But first, I want to give some context. So one of the really big differences we have in the land sector, which, agriculture, but also forestry, other sorts of land-based sectors, but also increasingly marine-based sectors like the seafood sector, is that the main gas isn't CO2. In pretty much every other sector, decarbonizing that sector is getting CO2 out, but actually for us, it's getting methane out, it's getting nitrous oxide out. Methane obviously primarily comes from cows and other ruminants, but also from manure in an enormous way. And nitrous oxide also from manure, from fertilizer in that supply chain often. And what that really means is that the vast majority of our emissions, they're biogenic. So we're not decarbonizing industrial processes here, we're decarbonizing animals. And that's a slightly different challenge, or we're decarbonizing, those animals might be tiny little microbes in the soil. They might be, full-sized cattle. They might be fish. It's a different challenge to many of the others, but it has a lot of the same approaches that you would have in any sector. So the first one you've got to get right is that baseline. It's about measuring your emissions in a consistent, in a repeatable, in a really easy to understand way. And we've got 2 sectors here. One of them's a mess, and one of them we decided we didn't want to be a mess. The land-based agriculture sector, there are 60 different footprinting tools that are available on the market today. And basically, we thought, that's a lot of complexity. Can we try and simplify that? The one benefit we had of the fish sector being slightly behind is that no one had come up with a seafood calculator that was being used widely. So we got together as a UK industry, and we're bringing in international partners as well now to develop this with our levee board Seafish and other companies within the industry to develop one single calculator that is essentially used across the industry. It is not perfect. It is far from perfect in many ways, but we're developing it as an industry, and because we're putting that resource in together, we're all asking our suppliers for one thing, the same thing, and we're asking for it once rather than asking for it 100 times. We're not putting that burden into the industry. We're not putting that challenge in of just the friction of having, I'm sure so many of you have been asked to report the same data in 6 different ways on 6 different platforms, and we sort of decided that wasn't how we wanted to go as a seafood sector, because we'd already seen the challenge that brings in the livestock sector, in the terrestrial livestock sector. So as an industry, we developed this, and I think we can do that in other sectors. I think there are multiple sectors where they can get together and say, you know what, there's really only a handful of us in this sector. Let's just agree on this one. Maybe it's not perfect, but if we're all using it, it becomes the standard and it's fine. Exactly as Chris Skidmore said earlier, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol wasn't the standard until basically everyone went, yeah, that's the standard, that'll do. And I think that's a really key thing that, as particularly emergent industries into this net zero space, where maybe there isn't this standardization already, we can do that. We're also looking at those metrics. We know that because we have that massive methane challenge, we actually can deliver different things because methane is a short-lived gas, only in the atmosphere for sort of 12-ish years as a half-life. we can deliver cooling effects that are beneficial. And maybe if we stop looking at CO2e as just CO2 equivalent and consider those gases separately, so I'm sure there'll be industries here where they have that different gas mix, you change your decision making. So we're currently working with Oxford Net Zero on, okay, what does that decision making change, or what decision making change would we make as an industry to deliver that potential benefit from methane, rather than constantly being seen as an equivalent to CO2, when there is a subtle difference in the way it behaves in the atmosphere that we can leverage to our advantage. And then we've developed our decarbonisation roadmap. So this broadly is what the terrestrial livestock industry looks like from an emissions perspective. In essence, we're working to reduce each of these. So I can't show you our beautiful waterfall graph because it's not public yet. But for each of these, we have a clear roadmap for how we can decarbonize getting deforestation is the easiest thing. So getting rid of deforestation, we shouldn't be deforesting any land anymore. Similarly, we need to look at making sure we're not making changes that induce deforestation. So if you move from a high yield oil to a low yield oil, are you actually just driving land clearance somewhere else? I'll come on to these two in a minute, but feed is a massive impact. So feed is that downstream of any livestock business. It's downstream of anyone. We're working very closely with our feed suppliers as well as our farmers. We have about 2 million farms in our supply chain. Getting to each of them is going to be very difficult, but we're working on that platform. We're working with governments to make it into law. We're working with certification bodies. We're working with assurance bodies, so that basically it's not every food company asking every farmer in the country. It's just the standard. And similarly, we're working on projects looking at how we can reduce emissions from vehicles as well. And I won't go into that because I'm sure everyone else is going to talk about energy, vehicles, that kind of thing. We have a research project. I'll tell you what, when I was studying as an automotive engineer, I didn't think I'd be stood next to this picture as often as I am. But you can see from our footprint, we've focused on the biggest parts of the footprint. And for us, that's enteric emissions and manure. But for whatever business you are, once you do those initial baselines of the footprint, you can find very quickly what those hotspots are and focus on them. For us, they were two very challenging areas we didn't fully understand, areas we thought were going to be very difficult to decarbonize, because basically, if you're an industrial company, if you're producing something in an industrial site, I can tell you how to decarbonize that. Stop making CO2, stop burning stuff. That's most sectors, it's how can we move away from burning stuff. With this, I can't stop my cows defecating. I can't stop them burping, for want of better words. That's just how they digest food. That's how we all digest food. But we've worked with Lincoln University primarily on research projects, quite short research projects, but quite short bursts that have essentially given us a clear roadmap for how we can reduce emissions from manure by about 80%. We can reduce emissions from cattle enteric fermentation by about 90%, using primarily products that exist. So that's not using things that work in a lab. It's using products that are available on the market today. And it's given us the confidence in that roadmap that we can deliver a credibly low carbon cow. Not one that's a fun accounting trick, but one that actually actively sequesters carbon in the soil and adds to that sequestration by being part of the land system. And for us, cattle is the biggest footprint across our business. It's something that's a lot harder with pork, frankly, because a pig is its feed. That's its main emission, but also because it's a house species, because it's a fed species, it's really hard to essentially produce crops without disturbing the land. And that's still something we're working on, but we're moving down that list of priorities to decarbonize different species as we go. But that's sort of how we've delivered the research to understand where we're going, and we're starting to roll this out. We're working, as I was saying, with various organizations to deliver this in sector. We're working to get these enteric inhibitors particularly on the market and rapidly deployed, and you'll have seen a major UK retailer do that this week. But also increasingly, we need to get this done. So we're working on this is a pilot at this stage, But one of our major seafoods that is produced on our sites is in Vietnam. It's Pangasius, which is a whitefish. And we've done some interesting research looking at the direct gases from that and how we can reduce that. But we're doing a program now on, okay, how can we work together on a financing package to essentially deploy solar panels across those sites and actually on top of the ponds, because not only does that improve energy use, it moves away from high carbon energy. Vietnam is decarbonizing very rapidly, but if we can help with that, that's beneficial. If we can take those sites that are often, frankly, dependent on backup generators, if we can essentially build a backup generator on every pond, we can deploy that, but also it improves welfare. It provides shade for those animals, it reduces evaporation losses, and benefits the whole system. So we're working on that across our different supply chains as well as Pangasius. We've started in Vietnam, but we'll be moving on to other supply chains as well. And then beyond that, we have to look at nature. The biggest influence on nature is cattle. The biggest influence is livestock by far, in a way that carbon, we're a sector. 75% of the land in the UK is agricultural. We're now looking at how can we measure that robustly? How can we measure that trophic impact of pasture livestock? We're working with this company, Chirrup, who have a bioacoustic AI that essentially you put a microphone in a field and it uses some very clever algorithms to essentially understand the trophic structure of that field. That's everything from me.